In 2013, a history professor at Rutgers University, James Goodman, wrote an article for the Los Angeles Times saying, the story in Genesis of Abraham's willingness to kill his son Isaac at God's command still gets a lot of attention, but it does not get a lot of love. In every broadside against religion, Goodman writes, God's horrifying demand for a sacrifice and Abraham's acquiescence is introduced as evidence that God is a tyrant. I cannot count the number of people who have told me that they first heard the story when they were young and forever afterward swore off religion and God. Many deeply devout people have grave reservations, Goodman writes. I have even heard clergy say they wish it were not in the Bible. Well, do you like being tested? What would you think if one day your husband, wife, employer, or your best friend put you to the test to see if you love them as much as they thought you should, or to see if you were as trustworthy and as honest as you ought to be? Now imagine being tested where the person doing the testing already knows the answer. They already know perfectly well what you'll do. They just want to see you do it. Today we're looking at the story of Abraham, a father who was asked by God to take his much-beloved son Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah, kill him, and burn the body. Abraham is given no explanation, just that one horrible command. But Abraham obeys. He takes Isaac to Mount Moriah, ties him up, puts him on the altar, and raises a knife to kill him when God intervenes, stopping Abraham, saying, okay, this was a test. Don't hurt the boy. Now I know. When we hear the story, our immediate emotional reactions generally fall into one of two categories. First, I guess we could say, yes, what a powerfully inspiring story. Abraham was willing to kill his son to obey the Lord in faith. How encouraging, how uplifting. Well, that's probably not how most people would react. Most of us would say something like, what? How could God do that to Abraham and to Isaac? How unfair, how cruel. He's God. He already knows everything. He already knows what's going to happen. He knows Abraham will pass the test, so why put him through all that anguish? Why put him through all that pain? Telling Abraham to perform a human sacrifice on his own son. Surely Abraham knew even that was totally wrong. And think of Isaac. Will he ever be able to fully trust his father again? The real kicker for a lot of people is verse 12, where God does say, now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. I mean, you almost agree with Bob Dylan, whose song Highway 61 has the line, God said to Abraham, kill me a son. Abe said, man, you must be putting me on. What kind of God is this? Can we love and worship, much less trust, such a God? Throughout the years, many people have decided no, they cannot. The great Christian philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote an entire book analyzing just this one story, retelling it from 4 different viewpoints, trying to reconcile God's demands with a good God. Kierkegaard ended up in a place of faith, but many people decide no, this is not a God they can worship, trust, or even believe in. Surely an all-good, all-loving, all-powerful God is not this. It is a difficult story from any point of view, so we'll look at it in 7 parts, starting with God's command to Abraham. So Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. He said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Okay. When we first meet Abraham in the Bible, about 25 years before this story takes place, it's in chapter 12 of Genesis, where God tells him in verse 1, go from your country and kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And Abraham, 75 years old at the time, obeyed. He took his wife, Sarai, his nephew Lot, all his possessions, and left, having no idea where they were going. Of course, God did bless Abraham, who learned to have deeper faith in God along the way, largely through some pretty spectacularly disastrous mistakes we don't have time to go into here. But God is faithful to his promises, and God does give Abraham and Sarah the desire of their hearts, a son named Isaac. Now, 25 years later, when our story opens, Abraham would probably be about 100 years old. Isaac would be at least a late teenager, maybe in his early 20s. Clearly, Isaac is the child to fulfill the promise of God that through Abraham's descendants, the whole earth would be blessed. But those of you who know the story know that before Isaac was born, there was Ishmael, a son born to Abraham not through God's plan, but through the human tradition at the time, where if a wife could not give birth, she would give one of her maidservants to her husband to have children by her. And we all know how that turned out. Abraham did have a child by Hagar, a child he no doubt loved, he took care of, had great hopes for, but he was not the son God had promised Sarah would have. Ishmael was not the child of God's promise. And as always happens when we try to improve on God's plans by our own wisdom, we hurry things along where God's taking too long, it ends up being a complete catastrophe. But by the time our story opens, Hagar and Ishmael have been sent away from Abraham's family compound. Clearly, Isaac, the child of the promise, is the focus of Abraham's love and hope. Probably Abraham thinks, okay, all that's left now is to raise a child, sit back, and watch God's plan unfold. But one day God calls to Abraham. Abraham says, "Here I am," just like he responded 25 years earlier. But now, when God again tells Abraham to go, it is very, very different. God tells him to take Isaac, go to Mount Moriah, build a very different kind of altar, and kill the child of the promise, the child of Abraham's heart. Reading from verse 2 in chapter 22, you can see 4 times God identifies Isaac, each time driving the point more and more clearly. Take your son. Okay, Abraham might have been thinking, I do have 2 sons. Maybe he means Ishmael. Take your only son. Well, Ishmael's my oldest. Maybe that's what God has in mind when Ishmael was my only son. Take the son whom you love. I love both of them. Take laughter. That's what Isaac means. Take the son I named Laughter. And from there, all we're told is that the next morning, early in the morning, Abraham hastens to obey God. This is kids' point number 1. When God tells you to do something, do it immediately. Do not wait. But God's asking Abraham to commit child sacrifice, human sacrifice. Never mind that it's his own child. Don't we all know that any child sacrifice is wrong? Should Abraham doubt that he's hearing God correctly? Well, you and I know that child sacrifice is wrong. But remember, this is before Moses. This is before God gave the Israelites the law with its clear instructions that child sacrifice, human sacrifice in general, is wrong. The religious cults around Abraham at this time in Canaan and where Abraham grew up practiced human sacrifice. Abraham certainly would have been familiar with it. Maybe he even saw his own family do it growing up. And remember, too, Abraham does not have the Old Testament. All he has is what God tells him whenever God decides to tell him something. There's nothing written down he can study and learn about God. Abraham's learning about God as he goes. So considering everything Abraham knows, he might be forgiven for thinking, well, child sacrifice, maybe that's what kind of a God this is. Verses 3 and 4. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. So he gets up early in the morning to obey God, and we can tell he's very flustered. We can tell he's very out of sorts, since he saddles a donkey before he chops the wood. Well, saddling a donkey is the last thing you do before you set out. He chops the wood himself instead of telling his servant to do it. This is not a man in his normal state of mind. Then they set out. I kind of wonder what he told Sarah about where they were going and why. God has him travel for 3 days, and having such a long time to think turns Abraham's obedience from reaction into decision. If God had told him, sacrifice Isaac right here, right now, back at the family compound, Abraham would have obeyed without having too much time to think about it. But now he's had a lot of time to think about it. Certainly he has wrestled in his heart and mind and arrived at the conscious decision that he will obey God no matter what. He simply has to trust that God will fulfill his promise about Isaac and his descendants, even though Abraham has absolutely no clue how it can possibly work out. Verses 5 and 6. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. Okay? So they arrive at the foot of the mountain, and Abraham tells the two servants, stay here with the donkey, Isaac. And then he says a very interesting thing. Isaac and I will go on alone, worship, and then we will come back. That's right. He tells the servants he and Isaac will return. Did Abraham know that God would tell him not to actually kill Isaac? Did he have a promise that the two of them would return safe and sound? No, he did not. He had no way of knowing that. What's likely is he thought God would perform some kind of a miraculous resurrection, but God makes no promise to do so. As far as Abraham knows, he will very soon kill and burn his son. Abraham took what was probably some kind of a fire stick and the knife. This would have been a large, very cruelly shaped knife, which had dismembered many bones, muscles, and ligaments. This knife had shed a lot of blood. He puts the wood on Isaac to carry. In our Sunday evening Bible study at my house, we're going through the book of Hebrews now. And one thing we're learning about is called typology. Typology is a study of the shadows in the Old Testament that point to the New Testament for their fulfillment. For example, the Old Testament law is a shadow, a hint of what's to come in the New Covenant, which Jesus would inaugurate. The great heroes of the Old Testament, the kings, the warriors, the priests, the whoever, are types of Christ, shadows of messiahs and saviors, all pointing forward to the perfect Savior, the perfect Messiah, the perfect priest, the perfect king who was to come in Christ Jesus. So typology is like symbolism. A person or thing in the Old Testament foreshadows a person or thing in the New Testament, and that's called a type. Isaac is a type of Christ. There are many typological references to Christ in the Old Testament. Jesus himself uses Jonah as a type of Christ, comparing himself to Jonah in that both were buried as dead for 3 days and then came out back to life. But in Isaac, we have a very striking typological foreshadowing of Jesus. Both were to be sacrificed on the orders of their father. Both carried wood to the place of their sacrifice. Both Isaac and Jesus were personally named by God himself. Isaac's parents were promised a son, but waited a long time for the promise to be fulfilled. The Hebrew people were promised a Messiah, but waited a long time for that promise to be fulfilled. Both Jesus and Isaac could have escaped their sacrifice, and both chose not to. Both were willing sacrificial lambs. And of course, here's where the type breaks down, because Isaac is not an exact parallel to Jesus. Isaac was to be a burnt offering. Jesus came to fulfill the entire mission that burnt offerings pointed towards, but could never fulfill, the total forgiveness of sin. And of course, in another profound difference, Isaac will be spared. He's only the type. He's only the shadow of what's to come. Jesus, the one to whom Isaac points, will not be spared. Jesus will suffer and die. Verses 7 and 8. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. Okay, here it is. The question Abraham must have been dreading the entire trip. He knew it was coming. He probably tried answering it 1,000 times in his mind already. But when the question is asked, Abraham turns to Isaac and says, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. God will provide. That's all Abraham knew. But he knew it for sure. God would provide. How? He had no idea. God had made promises about Isaac and all the descendants that were to come from Isaac. Promises that Abraham now saw absolutely no way of coming true, but Abraham did know one thing: he could trust God to provide. Which brings up kids' point number 2. When your parents ask you to do something you don't understand, go ahead and trust them. We're not perfect, but most of the time we are right. Incidentally, look at verse 8. In your Bible, it's punctuated with a comma before my son. So Abraham is answering Isaac's question, then saying, my son, to emphasize who he's speaking to. Like when your child asks where her school bag is, and you, being the helpful parent you are, say, well, it's in the last place you put it, Zelda. But the original Hebrew text is not punctuated. There are no commas, no full stops. All those are something scholars added later to help us read it easier. So what if we read that comma as a full stop? God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. It's interesting to consider. Most likely, Abraham's original intent is shown with a comma. Abraham saying to Isaac that God will provide. And as one source I read this week put it, Abraham is letting God be God. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means Abraham does not try to explain God to Isaac. He doesn't make excuses for God. He doesn't blame God. He doesn't use God as an excuse. He is willing to let God work in God's own mysterious ways. Abraham does not know how any of this is going to work out. All he knows is that God will provide. So he answers Isaac that God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, which is a remarkable statement because all at the same time, it's a declaration of trust, an expression of hope, and an accurate prophecy of the future. Verses 9 and 10. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son. Abraham has obeyed God to the letter. Abraham builds an altar, just like he did 25 years earlier when God first called him to go and follow where God would lead. God took him to a place called Shechem, and Abraham built an altar there to honor all the promises God had given him. And that had been a time of confidence and joy, a time of boundless optimism, as God gave Abraham extraordinary promises. But the altar Abraham's building now is the death of all that is joyful. It is the most difficult, the most hated thing he has ever had to build. Will he remember this altar as he remembers the one he built in Shechem? Oh, yeah. He'll remember this altar to the day of his death. When Abraham built the first altar in Shechem, he had wonderful promises from God. You will be the father of a great nation. I will give all this land to you. Well, it's easy to build an altar commemorating that, isn't it? With so many promises to look forward to, that's a fun altar to build. What promises does Abraham have for this altar he's building now? Yeah, you will kill and burn your only son. Yet Abraham obeys. Imagine as a parent just being ordered to cut your child's finger off. How many of us could do even that? And let's say the doctor promises that he can sew it back on again. Good as new. Still, how many of us parents could pick up a knife and chop our child's finger off? Now imagine as a parent being told to bind, kill, and burn your child with no promises for what happens after that. Abraham builds the altar. Then this 100-year-old man binds his son. Now the story of Abraham and Isaac is much more significant in Jewish tradition than it is in Christianity. This whole chapter, chapter 22, is known in Jewish tradition as the Akedah, from the Hebrew word for binding. It was retold in popular Jewish tradition as a prayer by Abraham to forgive and save future generations by remembering the binding of their father Isaac, just in case you need a more typology of Isaac as a type of Christ. Now remember, Abraham's 100 years old, but Isaac is a strong, healthy, fit young man. By this time, he has a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. He could have easily run away. He could have easily overpowered his aged father, but he doesn't. He allows himself to be bound. And if I were to insert a parent's point here, I would say, parents, be the kind of parent who your child can trust, this implicitly. This is the story of Abraham's faith. Sure, the focus is on Abraham, not Isaac, but take a moment to consider Isaac. Ponder the faith, the trust he's developed in his father. Abraham then lays Isaac on the altar. The Bible gives the detail on top of the wood. Abraham makes no attempt to evade even the smallest part of what God has commanded. After his son is dead, he will be burned. His body will not be given the decent burial any loving father would give a son. Abraham takes a knife in hand. No doubt Abraham has killed and dismembered many animals with the same knife. He knows what to do. He raises the knife. Verses 11 through 14. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Abraham has obeyed God to the point where in Abraham's mind he will kill Isaac. That was what God wanted. When Abraham raises the knife, he has put himself, Isaac, and every promise God has ever given to Abraham back into the hands of God. Abraham will not repeat the terrible mistake he made by having a son by Hagar, when he tried to improve on God's plan by taking God's promise into his own hands. And he will not commit the same terrible sin King Saul will commit centuries later. In 1 Samuel 15, when Samuel the prophet tells King Saul that the Lord has told Saul to go kill all the Amalekites, wipe them out completely, kill all the men, women, children, animals, cattle, sheep, camels, donkeys, house cats, everything. Saul wins the battle, but instead of obeying all of God's instructions, he spares the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves, the really good stuff. Oh, he kills all the weak ones. God tells Samuel what Saul has done, that Saul has not obeyed the Lord completely, and then makes him sad he ever made Saul king. Samuel goes to Saul. Samuel finds Saul building not an altar to the Lord, but a monument to his own glory. Samuel asks Saul, Saul, did you fully obey the Lord? Yes, Saul replies. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. Well then, Samuel says, what's all this bleating of sheep and lowing of cattle that I hear? Oh, that, says Saul. Yeah, about that. The soldiers brought those from the Amalekites. We were going to sacrifice them to your God. Note that, to your God. We did destroy the rest, totally. Samuel tells Saul God does not want his disobedient sacrifices. To obey is better than sacrifice. And because Saul has disobeyed God, God has rejected Saul. And the kingdom will be torn from Saul and given to one better than him. Abraham will not obey just most of God's command. He will obey completely. He will trust God fully. He will let God be God. So when Abraham raises the knife, at that instant he passes the test. The angel of the Lord calls from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And just as we consider the name Isaac, which means laughter, let's consider Abraham's name, the one God himself gave him to mean that he would be the father of many nations. So the angel of the Lord is literally calling out, Father of many nations, Father of many nations, stop. Abraham answers, here I am. The angel of the Lord tells Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And that is Abraham's first indication of what you have known all along. This was all God testing him. God never intended for Abraham to go through the sacrifice of Isaac. It was all to demonstrate to God that Abraham would have. Now, the Old Testament is full of God testing his people. This isn't the first or last time. He uses different tests for different reasons. There are 4 major kinds of tests we see in the Old Testament. First, God tests his people to reveal obedience. In Exodus 15:25, Moses takes the Israelites into the wilderness where there is no drinkable water. So God tells Moses to do what no doubt you and I would do. Throw a log in the waters of Marah to make it drinkable. And the Bible tells us this was a test for the people, as God tells them, if you listen to my voice and obey me, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians. Later, God tells Moses he will give the people manna in the wilderness in order to test them, whether they will walk in his way or not. Secondly, God tests his people to discover authenticity. In Deuteronomy 8:2, Moses is giving one of his last talks to the Israelites, telling them God led them in the wilderness for 40 years to humble them and to test them, to know what was in their hearts, whether they would keep his law or not. In 2 Chronicles 32:31, God said when the ambassadors from Babylon came to visit King Hezekiah, God left Hezekiah to himself for God to test Hezekiah and know all that was in his heart. Thirdly, God tests his people to produce their well-being. In Deuteronomy 8:16, God tells the Israelites through Moses that he fed them with manna in the wilderness for 40 years to test them so he could do good to them in the end. And fourthly, as is the case here with Abraham, God tests his people to produce fear in them to promote piety. Now, it's a rule of thumb that wherever you see the phrase fear of the Lord in the Old Testament, that's a Hebrew equivalent for faith in the New Testament. So in Exodus 20:20, God gives the 10 commandments to the people, and there's thunder and lightning and the sound of trumpets and the mountain smoke, and the people are terrified. And they tell Moses, you talk to God. Don't let God talk to us. We're going to die. Moses tells them, don't be afraid, for God has come to test them, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. So we understand this as God testing them that they may have faith in him, so they may not sin. In Psalm 26, David asks God to prove me, O Lord, and try me. Test my heart and my mind. For your steadfast love is before my eyes, and I walk in your faithfulness. In Psalm 139, David again prays, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, test me, and know my thoughts. And see if there be any grievous way in me. Lead me in the way everlasting. But Abraham did not ask God for this terrible test. He didn't even know it was a test. And while the Bible is clear that this was a test for God's benefit, for God to prove to himself that Abraham had faith in him, you can imagine the benefit to Abraham as well. Having acted out in real life that yes, no matter the situation, and he can't imagine the worst one. Abraham cannot imagine himself ever being in a worse situation. He will act in faith, and God will provide. And God does provide a sacrifice, the ram caught in the brush. And as one source says, there you had probably the most joyful sacrifice in human history. Kids, point number 3. When God tests you, and if you're walking with him, he will always provide for you. Whether you recognize it at the time or not, whether you can see how he will provide or not, whenever God puts you to a test, it's because he wants something good for you that you cannot get any other way. And he will provide for you as you obey. It reminds me of the story in Luke 17, where Jesus is going along the border between Samaria and Galilee. 10 lepers come up to him, begging him to heal them. Jesus does not heal them. Instead, he says, go show yourselves to the priests. Well, a leper would only show himself to the priest if he had been healed, because the priest would then confirm the healing and allow him back into the life of the community. You would never show yourself to a priest unless you knew you were healed. These guys are not healed. They're still lepers. But they obeyed Jesus. They set out to go to the priest, maybe feeling foolish, maybe thinking Jesus was playing a joke on them. But as they went, three of my favorite words in the entire New Testament, as they went, they were healed. Not before they went. Not they waited to go see the priest until they knew they were healed. No, when they were still as diseased with leprosy as they ever had been, they went off to see the priest to show him that they were healed. And because of their faith, they were healed along the way. It was a test. They passed. Do you object to God's right to test his people? Do you object to God's right to test you? Well, he tested Jesus. In the wilderness, God allowed Satan to come at a physically weakened, hungry Jesus with the three strongest tests Satan could think of. Friends, if Jesus himself is not above being tested by God, certainly Abraham is not. More certainly, you and I are not. And do you remember that Satan promised Jesus, who was starting his earthly ministry, all authority if Jesus would just bow down to him? Jesus refuses. At the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, in Matthew 28, Jesus tells the disciples all what? All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. By whom? By God, because Jesus obeyed God and passed the test in the wilderness. Growth in faith does require testing. God tests you because he loves you. If you've been thinking recently that you're not growing in faith as you would like, one certain way to grow in faith is to obey God when he asks you to do something you don't understand. So what conclusion do we draw from this story today? Obviously, there are many points we can learn from obedience, faith, and trust. God being faithful to his promises, learning to trust him, learning to trust that he will provide. There is one aspect to the story I referred to kind of in passing earlier that the more I thought about it, I think it's something I would like us all to take home. Because while this is a story about a long ago, faraway event with people from a thoroughly different culture, all dead, and while few of us will ever be in as staggering a test as Abraham was, we need to look at what Abraham did, and then we need to try that at home ourselves. Okay, what I'm about to try to explain is one of the mysteries of the Christian faith and belief that makes little sense to outsiders, but it's one of the most powerful truths of our faith. I can put it like this. The stark difference between Abraham obeying God the first time God calls him in chapter 12, when God calls him to go, and the last time God tells him to go, in our story here, is that the first time Abraham's given wonderfully attractive motivational promises from God. I will give you this land. I will make a mighty nation of you if you obey. Yeah, it's difficult to leave your home and family and all that you've ever known. But boy, if you have that promise in front of you, leaving home becomes a lot more doable. But on Mount Moriah, from his point of view, there's nothing in this for Abraham. No promise, no benefits, exactly the opposite, unimaginable pain, misery, and suffering. With Abraham has some hope, but no promise that God would even bring Isaac back. Yet he still obeys. For God's sake and God's sake alone, both times he builds an altar to God. And the principle is this: if you obey God because you'll get something out of it, that's one thing. Okay, I will go on record. It's always good to obey God. Frankly, we all have enough problems just doing that much, even when we know it's to our benefit. But it's when we can see no benefit at all, absolutely nothing but darkness, uncertainty, and fear in what God is asking of us, when we cannot explain to anyone what sense it makes other than God told me. That's when we reach the level of obedience Abraham shows in this story. Because as Christians, we do not obey to get benefits. We obey. God decides what benefits we get. We're not working a job where we're promised this amount of money for this amount of work and a bonus at Christmas if you do a really good job. We're just told to work, to obey and follow. God decides what we get when. Sometimes Not only will God not promise us good things for obeying, but he'll make obedience look like a path into the shadow of the valley of death. That's the level of obedience God is bringing Abraham to here. He did it with Job too, remember? Satan came to God and said, Job only loves you because you've given him so much. Job is in this for the benefits you give him, God. God says, okay, take away as many of those benefits as you want. So Satan takes away every good thing in Job's life. He leaves him his wife. And at absolute rock bottom, Job says, if God kills me, I will still trust him. When he said that, did Job know that God would, in fact, restore everything twice as much as Job had before? No. He had no reason whatsoever to think that his life would improve one iota from sitting in ashes, scraping his skin sores with a piece of a broken pot. In fact, the only answer Job ever gets from God, this God he's just expressed such wonderful, inspiring faith in, is, hey, Job, who are you to question me? I'm sorry, I'll close my mouth now. Abraham obeys God the first time when he leaves home and family to follow the promise that God laid out for him. Abraham obeys God the second time just to obey God with no promise of anything. Abraham would rather have killed himself 1,000 times than kill Isaac once. If God had given Abraham that choice, Abraham would have jumped at it gladly, but Abraham obeys. So what does God give him for that? Verses 15 through 19. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. Because you obeyed me, I will multiply your descendants. Now, God had promised many descendants to Abraham before, but this time he adds something new. He swears by himself. There's no stronger promise God can make than to swear by himself. And up until now, he has not done that. God has never given Abraham the promise in such powerful terms before. He does so now. This is the only place in the entire book of Genesis where God swears anything by his own character. God also promises for the first time, swearing by himself, that Abraham's descendants will be as numerous as sand on the shore. He's never promised that before. He does now. God also promises for the first time, swearing by himself, that Abraham's descendants will possess the gates of their enemies, meaning they'll live in the cities other people built. He's never promised that before. He does so now. And all these promises are also to Isaac, the one through whom all the promises will come true. It's Abraham's complete dependence on God that secures his son's future in much stronger and much more comprehensive terms than ever before. And from now on, in the rest of the Bible, this oath, this promise God swears by his own character, here on Mount Moriah, rams still smoking on the altar, this is a promise that is referred to as the basis for all the divine blessings of future generations. So if you leave here thinking, I'm not sure I could sacrifice my child if God asked me to, don't worry. Few of us could. That's not how you try this at home. But there is something in all of our lives, something God is asking us to obey him in, and it is an area where we're resisting obedience because we either can't see any benefit for us or we simply don't want to give it up. Well, surely a good, loving God wouldn't ask me to give that up. Well, in Luke 14, Jesus asks us to give up our family to follow him if need be. If you think God will not ask you to give up good things unless you can see a crystal clear reason why it's your benefit to do so, read Luke 14, then read Genesis 22 again. Go home and try it. I can promise you that when you obey God without seeing or understanding the reason for it, that will be a time you look back on as a time that you grew more than you ever thought you could. You will have built an altar you will always remember. Let's pray. We thank you so much that you are a Father we can trust much, much, much more than we ever do. You will provide for us, and you will ask us to do very difficult things as we are ready for them. So I pray that we will all remember this story, and it will just remind us all what kind of a God we have. It's in your name we pray. Amen.